You're crouched in the dark, chewing something bitter off a leaf you weren't supposed to touch. Your mouth goes numb. Your heart starts pounding for no reason at all. And somewhere behind your eyes, the world starts to bend. This isn't an accident. You picked this plant on purpose. And you are not the first human being to do this, not by 100,000 years. Right now, somewhere in your body, there's a question you've never asked yourself. Why do humans want to feel different? Not hungry different, not tired different, but chemically, deliberately, dangerously different. Ancient humans asked that same question, and they answered it with fire, fungus, fermented fruit, and plants that could just as easily kill them as change them. This is the story of how our ancestors turned intoxication into one of the oldest survival tools on Earth. And by the end, you'll understand why your own brain is still running the exact same program. Picture this. You are a hunter-gatherer 40,000 years ago. You've just eaten fermented berries that sat too long in a hollow log. Your legs feel loose. Your laughter comes easier. For a few hours, the constant tension of survival, predators, hunger, tribal politics, melts away. You don't know it yet, but you've just stumbled into one of the most important discoveries in human history. Not fire, not tools, altered consciousness. Here's the part that should unsettle you. Scientists studying primate behavior have found that animals seek out fermented fruit on purpose. Not by accident. Elephants, monkeys, even fruit flies show clear preference for alcohol-laced food sources. This means the drive to alter your mind might not even be uniquely human. It might be older than humanity itself. Sit with that for a second. Before we had language, before we had cities, before we even had modern brains, something inside us was already reaching for the bottle. But here's what scientists actually found when they dug deeper into the archaeological record. This wasn't rare. This wasn't accidental. This was constant, repeated, and deliberate across nearly every early human population on Earth. Sites in China show fermented rice and honey beverages dating back 9,000 years. Residue in pottery from the Zagros Mountains in Iran shows deliberate winemaking 8,000 years ago. And that's just what survived. The real number is almost certainly older, and almost certainly darker. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. You've probably assumed drugs and alcohol were a modern invention, a symptom of decadent, comfortable societies with too much free time. But that assumption is completely backwards. Ancient humans were using mind-altering substances while they were still fighting for their lives against saber-toothed predators. They weren't doing this despite the danger of their world. Some researchers believe they were doing it because of it. Think about what daily life actually felt like 40,000 years ago. Every single day carried the possibility of violent death. A snapped ankle could mean starvation. A single infected wound could kill you in a week. Every sound in the dark might be a predator circling your camp. Now ask yourself, what does a nervous system do when it's forced to live like that every single day for an entire lifetime? It breaks, unless it finds a release valve. That release valve might be exactly what intoxicants provided. Researchers studying the neuroscience of stress have found that chronic high alert states physically damage the brain over time. Cortisol floods the system. Fear circuits get stuck in the on position. And your ancestors were living in that state permanently. A single night of altered consciousness, numbing that fear response even briefly, might have been the difference between staying sane and losing the will to keep surviving at all. Here's a question that should make you squirm a little. If you had to survive in that world, starving, exhausted, terrified every single night, would you have said no to the one plant in the forest that made the fear disappear for a few hours? Most people, if they're honest with themselves, wouldn't. And that's exactly the trap your ancestors walked into, one leaf, one berry, one mushroom at a time. But this wasn't only about escaping fear. There's a stranger, more disturbing theory that's gained serious traction among anthropologists in the last decade. Some believe altered states weren't just a coping mechanism, they were a communication technology. A way for early humans to access thoughts, patterns, and connections their normal waking brain couldn't reach. In other words, some of our ancestors' most important ideas might have come from being high. Sit with that for a second because it changes everything you thought you knew about how human intelligence developed. Cave art, early symbolic thinking, the invention of ritual and myth. Some researchers now believe hallucinogenic plants may have played a direct role in triggering these leaps. It's called the Stoned Ape Hypothesis. And while it's controversial, it's not fringe nonsense. It's been seriously debated in academic circles for decades. Here's the scene that gets used to illustrate it. You're deep inside a cave, torch flickering against damp stone. You've eaten something that scrambles your senses. Maybe a psilocybin mushroom growing in the dung near your camp. Colors bleed into sound. Time stretches strangely. And in that altered state, your hands start moving across the rock wall, tracing shapes you've never consciously planned. Is that art? Is that communication? Or is that the very first spark of human symbolic thought, triggered by a chemical accident? But here's what scientists actually found when they examined psilocybin's effect on the modern human brain. It doesn't just create hallucinations. It dramatically increases connectivity between brain regions that normally don't talk to each other. Regions responsible for memory, emotion, and abstract thought suddenly start firing together in new combinations. In other words, altered states don't just distort reality, they can genuinely create new pathways of thought that didn't exist before. Now here's your first real gut punch reframe, because everything you assumed at the start of this video needs to be corrected. You probably pictured ancient drug use as reckless, chaotic, animalistic behavior. Cavemen getting wasted around a fire. But the evidence tells a completely different story. Early intoxicant use appears to have been ritualized, controlled, and deeply tied to survival strategy, not chaos but calculated risk. Ancient humans weren't out of control. They were experimenting with the very edges of consciousness on purpose. Consider the physical risk involved. Many of the plants and fungi our ancestors experimented with were just as capable of killing them as changing their minds. A slight miscalculation with certain mushrooms means organ failure. Certain plant alkaloids stop the heart in the wrong dose. This wasn't a casual afternoon activity. Every single time an ancient human tried a new substance, they were gambling with their life to test the boundaries of their own mind. Why would anyone take that risk? Here's where modern psychology sneaks back into the story. Humans have something researchers call a novelty-seeking drive, rooted deep in dopamine reward pathways. It's the same drive that makes modern humans skydive, binge-watch new shows, or scroll endlessly for the next dopamine hit. Ancient humans had that exact same wiring, except their version of novelty-seeking came with a body count. Here's your first uncomfortable modern comparison. Right now, in your own life, you probably reach for something to change your internal state without even thinking about it. Coffee to feel sharper. Alcohol to feel looser. Your phone to feel distracted from anxiety. You are running the exact same ancient software your prehistoric ancestors ran, the drive to alter consciousness on demand. The substances have changed. The instinct hasn't moved an inch in 40,000 years. Now let's talk about something even stranger, the role these substances played in group bonding. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies today, including groups whose lifestyles closely mirror ancient humans, have documented ritual substance use as a core part of social cohesion. Shared intoxication wasn't just personal escape. It was glue. It bonded strangers into allies, and allies into something that felt like family. Here's a scene worth sitting inside for a moment. You're part of a small band of survivors, maybe 20 people total. Your entire existence depends on trust. Trust that someone will watch for predators while you sleep. Trust that food will be shared fairly. Trust that no one will abandon you when things get hard. Now imagine a ritual where the entire group drinks a fermented brew together, lowering every single person's guard at the same time. What does that create? Vulnerability. And shared vulnerability, evolutionary psychologists argue, builds trust faster than almost anything else. But here's what scientists actually found when they studied this phenomenon more closely. Alcohol and mild intoxicants lower activity in the brain's threat detection centers. In group settings, that means people become measurably more open, more cooperative, and more likely to share resources. In a world where cooperation quite literally meant survival, a ritual that reliably produced trust wasn't a luxury. It may have been one of the most important social technologies our species ever developed. This is where the story takes its first genuinely dark turn. If altered states could build trust that fast, they could also be weaponized just as fast. Some anthropologists believe early ritual leaders and shamans understood this and used it. Controlled substance rituals weren't just about connection. They were about control. Whoever controlled the ritual controlled the group's most vulnerable emotional state. Think about what that actually means. If you were the person in your tribe who understood which plants caused visions, which caused calm, and which caused chaos, you didn't just have knowledge. You had power over other people's minds. That's not a footnote in history. Some researchers argue it's the origin point of organized religious and political authority. The first power structures in human history might have been built, quite literally, on drugs. Here's a pattern interrupt worth pausing on. We've been talking about ancient humans this whole time like they're distant, alien figures. But ask yourself honestly, does any of this sound unfamiliar? Substances that lower inhibition. Group rituals that build loyalty. Leaders who control access to altered states and use that control to gain influence. That's not just prehistory. That's a pattern that's repeated itself across nearly every human civilization that followed, right up to today. Now here's the midpoint reset, because what you're about to hear was deliberately left out of most textbooks for a very specific reason. For decades, mainstream archaeology avoided seriously discussing prehistoric drug use, partly because it complicated the tidy narrative of humans as rational, tool-building problem solvers. Admitting our ancestors were regularly altering their consciousness on purpose didn't fit the story anthropology wanted to tell about human progress. So for a long time, this entire chapter of human history was quietly minimized. That changed when new residue analysis technology let scientists detect microscopic chemical traces on ancient pottery, teeth, and tools. Suddenly, the evidence was undeniable. Traces of opium alkaloids on Bronze Age vessels in Cyprus. Cannabis residue on altars in ancient Israel dating back nearly 3,000 years. Coca leaf remnants in South American burial sites. The deeper scientists dug, the more it became clear this wasn't rare behavior. It was nearly universal. Here's a detail that should genuinely disturb you. In 2020, archaeologists analyzing an altar at a shrine in Tel Arad, Israel, confirmed cannabis had been deliberately burned as part of religious ritual, combined with animal dung to help it combust at the right temperature for inhalation. This wasn't random. This was engineered. Someone, thousands of years ago, had already figured out the exact conditions needed to get a room full of worshippers high in a controlled ritual setting. Let that sink in for a second. That's not primitive behavior. That's chemistry. That's ritual design. Ancient humans weren't stumbling onto altered states by accident anymore at this point in history. They were manufacturing the experience on purpose with precision, inside sacred spaces built specifically for that purpose. The line between primitive superstition and deliberate neuroscience is a lot blurrier than most people assume. But that wasn't even close to the most disturbing evidence uncovered. In parts of ancient Peru, archaeologists have found evidence linking hallucinogenic substance use directly to ritual violence and human sacrifice. Altered states weren't just used to bond communities. In some cultures, they were used to prepare both victims and participants for extreme, irreversible acts. The same chemical tool that built trust in one context was used to suppress fear and resistance in another. Here's the question that should crawl under your skin a little. If a substance can make a person more trusting, more open, less afraid, what happens when that vulnerability is exploited instead of protected? Ancient humans discovered something incredibly powerful when they found these plants. But powerful tools don't come with a built-in morality. The same chemistry that soothed grief and built community could just as easily be used to control, manipulate, or harm. Let's slow down and connect this to something closer to home, because this is modern psychology reframe number 2. Right now, entire industries are built around understanding exactly how substances lower your guard. Marketing, nightlife, even some forms of social media design borrow the same core principle ancient ritual leaders discovered instinctively. Lower inhibition equals higher influence. Your ancestors figured that out around a fire pit. Modern institutions figured out how to scale it. Now here's a shift in the story that most people don't expect. Not every ancient culture that discovered these substances used them for ritual or bonding. Some individuals appear to have used them purely, quietly, for personal relief, something disturbingly close to what we'd now call self-medication. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites shows certain plant residues concentrated specifically in the remains of individuals who suffered chronic pain or visible injury. In other words, some of our ancestors weren't chasing visions. They were just trying to survive the pain of being alive. Picture a hunter with a shattered leg that never healed correctly. No modern medicine. No painkillers except what grows nearby. Every single day, walking is agony. And then one plant, bitter, dangerous, sometimes fatal in the wrong dose, makes that pain fade just enough to function. Would you call that abuse? Or would you call that the earliest form of medicine humanity ever developed? The line between medicine and drug use might be far newer than we assume, and far blurrier than we're comfortable admitting. Here's where the rhetorical question lands hard. If you were in constant, grinding pain with zero medical options, and one dangerous plant offered relief, would you really say no? Most people wouldn't. And once you admit that to yourself, ancient substance use stops looking like recklessness. It starts looking like the only option available in a world with no alternatives. But here's what scientists actually found when they studied how quickly tolerance and dependence develop biologically. The human brain doesn't distinguish much between recreational use and medical use at the neurochemical level. Repeated exposure to the same reward pathway, regardless of the reason behind it, rewires the brain the same way. This means some of our ancestors, whether they meant to or not, may have developed genuine chemical dependencies tens of thousands of years before the concept of addiction even existed as an idea. That raises an unsettling possibility. Addiction isn't a modern disease born from modern excess. It might be a fundamental vulnerability baked into the human brain itself, one that's existed as long as humans have had access to mind-altering substances, which, based on the evidence, is basically as long as humans have existed at all. Now here's the third modern psychology connection, and it might be the hardest one to sit with. Every single behavior we've described, seeking relief from constant stress, using substances to build group trust, leaders exploiting altered states for control, individuals self-medicating chronic pain, every one of those patterns is still fully active in modern human society today. We didn't outgrow any of this. We just changed the packaging. Here's a pattern interrupt worth pausing on before the final act of this story. You might be tempted to think this is all just interesting trivia about ancient behavior, safely locked away in the past. It's not. Every mechanism described here, stress relief, social bonding, ritual control, self-medication, dependency, is a fully operational part of your own neurological wiring right now, in this exact moment, whether or not you've ever touched a substance in your life. Now we arrive at the darkest part of this story, the part most documentaries leave out entirely. Because altered consciousness wasn't only used to build community or ease pain. In several ancient cultures, it was systematically used as a tool of domination. Not by outsiders, by insiders. By the very people early societies trusted the most. Archaeological and ethnobotanical evidence from multiple ancient cultures suggests that access to certain powerful hallucinogens was deliberately restricted to a small ruling or priestly class. Ordinary members of the tribe might never taste these substances in their entire lives. But leaders did, regularly. And in doing so, they positioned themselves as the only ones capable of communicating with whatever forces the group believed controlled their fate. Think about what that actually creates. If only the leader can access altered states, and altered states are believed to be a gateway to spiritual truth, then the leader effectively becomes the only valid source of divine information. Nobody can challenge them because nobody else has access to the same experience. This isn't spirituality. This is one of the earliest known blueprints for authoritarian control in human history, built entirely on selective access to brain chemistry. Here's the detail that makes this even darker. In some documented cases across ancient Mesoamerican cultures, powerful hallucinogens were administered not just to leaders, but specifically to sacrificial victims before ritual execution, believed to ease their fear, suppress resistance, and create the appearance of willing, even joyful, participation in their own death. Altered consciousness wasn't just used to build trust. In its most extreme historical form, it was used to manufacture consent for horror. Sit with that for a moment, because it's genuinely one of the most disturbing applications of ancient chemistry ever documented. A substance discovered because it eased fear and built human connection was, in its darkest expression, turned into a tool for controlling a person's final, most terrifying moments alive, engineering their compliance instead of easing their suffering out of kindness. But here's what scientists actually found when they examined this pattern across multiple unrelated ancient cultures on different continents, with no contact between them. The same basic strategy shows up again and again. Substance-assisted control of fear. Substance-assisted manufacturing of trust. Substance-assisted suppression of resistance. This wasn't one isolated culture's dark secret. It appears to be a repeatable, almost universal human pattern, one that emerges again and again whenever power, fear, and access to altered consciousness intersect. Here's the question that should genuinely make you uncomfortable, because it's not really about the past anymore. If ancient humans, with far less scientific understanding than we have today, figured out how to use altered consciousness to manufacture trust, suppress fear, and manipulate group behavior, what makes you so certain that same basic strategy has disappeared from the modern world? It hasn't disappeared. It's just gotten better at hiding. Now here's the closing turn of this story, and it's the part that should genuinely stay with you. Every instinct we've described, chasing relief from unbearable stress, seeking connection through shared vulnerability, self-medicating pain with whatever's available, following leaders who claim special access to truth. None of that instinct has switched off in modern humans. 40,000 years of evolution barely moved the needle on any of it. You are still running the exact same emotional operating system your ancestors were running around that first fire, chewing that first bitter leaf. The substances have changed shape. The rituals have changed names. But the underlying human need, the need to escape unbearable feeling, even for just a little while, even at real risk to yourself, that need is exactly as old as humanity itself. Maybe older. Maybe it's the very thing that made us human in the first place, for better and for worse. So the next time you reach for coffee to feel sharper, or a drink to feel looser, or your phone to feel distracted from something uncomfortable sitting underneath your skin, remember that you're not doing anything new. You're doing the oldest thing humans have ever done. 40,000 years ago, someone crouched by a fire, ate something they weren't sure was safe, and changed how they felt on purpose. You've been doing the exact same thing your entire life. The only real question left is whether you're in control of that instinct, or whether it's still quietly in control of you.